June 25, 1876, the day of the Battle of Little Bighorn. This moment stands as a testament to bravery and the shadows of history that still baffle many. But what if you could step back in time and see it all unfold through the eyes of someone who lived it? George B. Herondine's account is more than a mere recollection. It's a window into the essence of Custer's final stand. Prepare to witness the raw truth, the intense emotions, and the unforgettable narrative of a battle that altered the course of American history. Sit back, take a breath, and let's journey together through this compelling tale. As you watch this, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. We're building a community of truth seekers and history enthusiasts, and your support means the world. There's been a lot of misinformation about the Little Bighorn battle circulating in the Herald and other papers, with many accounts skewed to mislead the public. I was there with Reno through the entire ordeal, witnessing events before and after the clash. I didn't see it all, but what I did see, I'll recount exactly as it happened. My journey began with General Gibbon's command at the Rosebud's mouth when Generals Terry and Custer joined forces with us. General Terry granted me permission to march with Custer up the Rosebud. I remember discussing this with Terry in General Gibbons's tent and later on the steamer Far West, anchored at the Rosebud's mouth. Terry asked about the terrain surrounding the upper parts of the Rosebud and Tulloch's Fork. I was on the deck when I was summoned to a council of war inside, where Generals Terry, Gibbons, Custer, and Brisbane were discussing strategy. Terry showed me a map, asking for my knowledge about the land near Tulloch's Fork and the Little Bighorn. From the conversation, it was clear that Terry was figuring out where Custer's and Gibbons's columns should unite, with Custer moving up the Rosebud and Gibbons along the Bighorn. Having crossed this terrain before, I shared what I knew. Custer seemed pleased with my information and wanted me to accompany him. Later, General Gibbons approached me, confirming that I was now part of Custer's team. We talked briefly about my role as a scout and the compensation involved, which was finalized on June 21st, shortly before General Gibbons left the boat. Later that day, General Brisbane emerged from the cabin, and I asked about his cavalry's likely position in the coming days, so I could find them. He mentioned they'd probably be near the mouth of the Little Bighorn. On June 21st at noon, I reported to General Custer and was assigned to Lieutenant Varnum, who commanded a group of scouts. It was there that I met Mish Boyer, a half-breed scout and guide who was with Varnum. We set out on the 22nd around noon, making our way up the Rosebud. Leading the way were Boyer and Bloody Knife, a fellow scout, with Custer right behind them. Lieutenant Varnum and his scouts followed closely, just ahead of the main column. We covered about 12 miles before setting up camp at 5 p.m. General Custer called for revelry at 4 a.m., with orders to be ready to march by 5 a.m. on the morning of the 23rd. We departed promptly at 5 a.m., following the stream for 4 or 5 miles before encountering an Indian trail Reno's men had traced days before. We followed this trail until 5 p.m., when we made camp for the night. That evening, Custer sent the Crow Scouts ahead to gather information. On the morning of the 24th, we broke camp at 5 a.m. and continued along the trail. Not long after, Custer, who was ahead with Boyer, called me over and mentioned he might send me and Charlie Reynolds to scout ahead at Tulloch's Fork. I suggested it was too early for that, given we were still heading towards Tulloch, and I could only follow the trail. I asked Boyer to confirm, and he agreed, noting that further up the Rosebud, we'd find a gap allowing us to cut across to Tulloch in about a 15-mile ride. Custer responded, "Very well, I can wait." We hadn't gone much further when the Crow Scouts returned, reporting that the trail ahead was growing fresher, and they had found new pony tracks. They also brought with them the scalp of a white man, which was later identified as belonging to Stoker, a soldier from Company H, 2nd Cavalry, killed days earlier at the Rosebud's mouth. Upon hearing this, Custer halted the command, dismounted the men, and called the officers together for a council. Although I was too far to hear the details, we resumed our slow march after a brief halt. We soon reached Muddy Creek, where the 2nd Cavalry had clashed with Lame Deer's band the previous spring. As we crossed, I noticed some lodges had veered from the main trail and headed up Muddy Creek. I followed briefly, then informed Custer. He immediately halted the command and sent Lieutenant Varnum to investigate. Custer didn't want to lose any lodges and insisted on being notified if any deviated from the main trail. While Varnum was away, we halted and the men prepared dinner. Varnum returned 2 hours later, reporting that the Muddy Trail rejoined the main trail further along. We then resumed our march, following a trail that was becoming fresher by the minute. We passed several campsites, suggesting the Indians were moving slowly in search of grazing land. As evening approached, Custer deployed flankers and maintained a sharp lookout to prevent any lodges from escaping. He aimed to capture the entire village without letting any stragglers get away. At dusk, we made camp on the trail, which was now very fresh. The general sent Varnum, Boyer, and some scouts ahead to scout the trail and surrounding terrain. The men were instructed to graze their animals, have supper, and be ready to depart at 11 p.m. Everyone rested until 10 p.m., then packed up and moved out. The night was pitch dark and progress was slow. After about 10 miles, we halted at 2 a.m., unsaddled the horses, and allowed the men and animals to rest. The scouts returned during the night, informing Custer they had located the Indian camp. We packed up and advanced at first light. Mitch Boyer and Reynolds, who had been scouting, reported the camp was enormous. Boyer remarked that it was the largest village he'd ever seen, and Reynolds agreed, noting the vast numbers. Custer confidently declared, "I can defeat them." However, Reynolds warned it would take 6 hours of intense fighting to win. On the morning of June 25th, the final day of our march, Custer halted the troops and concealed them as best he could. He then took an orderly and rode about 4 miles up to the divide where Lieutenant Varnum and Boyer were stationed, hoping to catch a glimpse of the village on the other side along the Little Bighorn. While Custer was away, I followed the trail up the dry fork of the Rosebud, but hadn't gone far when I spotted 2 figures crossing the hills toward the Little Horn. Custer was gone for about an hour and a half, and upon his return, Boyer asked if I had seen the Indians. I replied that I had seen what looked like Indians. Boyer exclaimed, "You were within 150 yards of them, and you surprised them. They fled back to camp as quickly as they could." Custer sounded officers' call, issued orders, and divided the column into battalions. Once the orders were given, we advanced up the divide at a brisk pace, covering 3 or 4 miles before reaching the summit. The scouts, led by Lieutenants Varnum and Hare, then pressed on ahead at a gallop, with the command following at a trot. I rode with the scouts as we followed a creek flowing towards the Little Bighorn. As we neared the creek's mouth, we spotted a lone lodge on the bank. We climbed a hill to flank and overlook the lodge, only to find it abandoned. From the hilltop, we saw a massive dust cloud and fleeing livestock down by the Little Bighorn. We also spotted a few Indians on the hills, riding swiftly and seemingly escaping. I shouted that the Indians were getting away and urged us to hasten our pursuit or risk losing them. Lieutenant Hare quickly wrote a note to Custer, though I'm unsure of its contents, but I believe he expressed our concern that the Indians were fleeing. Custer was nearby, riding at a fast trot. The scouts rushed down to the abandoned lodge, slashed it open, and found a dead Indian inside. Custer arrived just as we were inspecting the lodge, with Colonel Reno at the forefront of the advance. I caught Custer instructing Reno, "Reno, take the scouts and lead the way. I'll be right behind you." Reno spurred his horse into a swift gallop, urging his men to keep control of their mounts. My horse stumbled, causing a slight delay, but I quickly caught up with Reno at the fort. As we crossed the river, the Crow Scouts called out to each other in their language, "The Sioux are coming." Understanding their words, I warned Reno, "The Sioux are on their way." Reno halted briefly, allowing the command to close ranks before we crossed the Little Bighorn and formed a battle line on the prairie just beyond the timber. The formation was smooth and continuous, moving from a trot to a gallop. As we pressed on, it became clear that a large force of Indians awaited our approach. We advanced about half a mile, with the Indians setting fires to the timber on our right flank and directly ahead. A few were positioned within the timber, and we opened fire on them, though they did not return the shots. Shortly after, we dismounted, forming a skirmish line facing the hills. The line extended to the left and front, and firing began almost immediately, with the Indians positioned near the base of the hills in the small valley. The exchange of gunfire intensified as the Indians attempted to encircle us. Our horses were led into the timber on our right and rear, while the soldiers retreated to find cover among the bushes and small trees. Inside the timber, we found a small clearing where the command regrouped and remounted. I was among the last to reach the timber and paused to fire at some Indians who had entered from the left and rear. Once I joined the command in the clearing, we experienced a brief lull before a sudden volley erupted from the bushes. Bloody Knife, positioned directly in front of me, and Reno to my left were both struck. The volley took Bloody Knife's life, and one soldier cried out, "Oh my God, I've been hit." Reno ordered us to dismount, only to countermand the order moments later, telling us to remount. However, not all had managed to get back on their horses when Reno led the charge out of the timber onto the prairie. The men scattered, each trying to escape the woods as quickly as possible, running at an angle toward the Little Bighorn River. I followed the command out of the timber, with about half the men ahead of me and the other half behind. The dust was so thick that it was impossible to see where we were headed. Just as I emerged onto the prairie, my horse stumbled and fell, throwing me off before bolting away. I retreated back to the timber about 150 yards away and took cover among the bushes. As I turned back, I heard an officer shout, "Halt, men, halt, let us fight them." As soon as Reno's troops emerged from the timber, the Indians swiftly closed in, attacking from all sides. After my horse threw me, I returned to the timber and encountered Lieutenant Dirudio, pausing to converse with him. As we spoke, a group of about a dozen soldiers, some on foot and others on horseback, approached. I urged them to seek cover in the timber, where we could defend ourselves against the Indians. They quickly joined us, and we secured our horses to the trees. Just as we had settled into our defensive position, firing erupted below us, signaling that Custer's forces had engaged the enemy. We observed a significant number of Indians leaving their attack on Reno's troops and racing down the valley at full speed. The firing down the valley was intense and sustained, with 9 distinct volleys at regular intervals, punctuated by rapid fire in between. This heavy gunfire continued for about 3/4 of an hour to an hour before gradually subsiding into silence. I turned to the men with me and said, "Boys, it's time we moved on." I pointed out that the fighting below had ceased, and though the outcome was uncertain, I suspected the Indians had gained the upper hand. I cautioned that we should retreat before the Indians returned up the valley. I led the way, and the men followed. We encountered only 5 Indians between us and Major Reno's position. From about a mile away, we spotted Reno's troops halted on a hill. I rejoined Reno at 5 p.m. Once we emerged from the timber, we saw large numbers of Indians advancing up the valley. As I ascended the hill, Reno's forces began to move in the direction Custer had taken, but they were quickly repelled by the Indians and forced back to their original position on the hill. The Indians launched a fierce attack on Reno's troops, persisting until nightfall. The next day, June 26th, the battle resumed at dawn and continued until 4:01 p.m. The men suffered greatly from thirst, and as many as 7 were wounded while attempting to procure water. I believe Captain Ben Teen saved the fight on the hill. None of us knew with certainty what had become of General Custer until General Terry arrived with Gibbon's command on the morning of June 27th. The number of Indians that attacked Reno's command in the flat on June 25th likely did not exceed 200 warriors. I do not believe anyone had been killed before his retreat into the timber, and only one man had fallen when he made a break for the bluffs. Contrary to reports, the horses were not exhausted, and the men were not worn out and sleepy when we arrived at the battlefield. On the contrary, the animals were fresh, and Custer led a group of men who were as well fed and cheerful as any who ever went into battle. Our initial impression was that the Indians were fleeing, and our only concern was that they might escape before we could engage them. I do not believe Custer's engagement lasted for a significant duration. It was likely concluded within less than 2 hours. However, at one point the intensity of the firing led us to think that Custer was advancing, and the Indians seemed unsure of the battle's outcome. They began dismantling their lodges and packing up the village, suggesting they were preparing to flee. The distance from the Rosebud's mouth, where Custer began his march, to the battlefield at the Little Bighorn's mouth spanned over 100 miles. Our daily progress was as follows: 12 miles on the first day, 35 miles on the second, 33 miles on the third, and between 25 and 28 miles on the fourth and final day. We departed at noon on June 22nd and arrived at the battlefield around noon on June 25th. Contrary to popular accounts, Custer did not exhaust his men and horses by pushing them excessively. In fact, a heavily laden pack train kept pace with us throughout the journey. From my vantage point, Custer's movements during the march were deliberate, methodical, and exemplified soldierly conduct in every respect. I hope this first-hand account offers a new perspective on the Battle of Little Bighorn and the Great Sioux War of 1876. Stay tuned for more videos like this. I look forward to bringing you more first-hand accounts of different battles, so have a great day and I'll see you next time.